Good morning and welcome to our first Connecting with Nature Live. My name is James. I'm an outdoor host and enthusiast here at the Malahat Skywalk. And as you can see, we are here at the start of our 600-meter elevated walkway that leads out to a spiral tower that rises 10 stories up above Finlayson Arm and Squally Reach. First, I want to gratefully acknowledge that we are here on the traditional ancestral territory of the Malahat Nation, part of the Coast Salish peoples. When we walk into this forest, it is pretty easy to get overwhelmed by the magnitude of coastal Douglas fir forest. We of course have Douglas firs rising up to well over 30 meters. We also have western red cedar and even Gary oak and arbutus trees. So when we see that and the mountains and the fjords, sometimes the gigantic things take our attention away, and we sometimes forget to take a look at some of the smaller things in nature. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about some of the smaller organisms that are equally vital to making this a healthy environment for all of us. So today, the first thing we're going to talk about is moss. Moss is something that you've probably well versed in. You've probably seen it many times. We all know that moss seems to grow in very moist areas, but I'll tell you a little bit more about moss. We have some right here. As you can see, it is very plant-like. It actually grows on trees and sometimes on rocks. It actually is what we call a non-vascular plant. It actually doesn't have roots, so it's not drawing water up out of the ground or nutrients. It's actually attached to whatever it happens to like, in this case a piece of wood, using rhizoids that actually connect it to that. And all of the moisture that it's getting is actually coming from the air. That can be either in the form of mist or fog or humidity, or in some cases it can actually be actual rain or flooding that's coming around. So one of the questions we have for you is, do you know how much moisture moss can absorb in terms of its own body weight? I look forward to any of your comments on our chat, either on Instagram or on Facebook. Certainly ask any questions that you have at the same time, and I'll do my best to answer them during the course of this Connecting with Nature Live. If I don't get a chance to answer them all, we can put them out on our Friday Fun Facts, and other times we'll get to them in future shows. If you have great ideas for us to follow up on, we'd love to do that as well. All right? So moss seems to be everywhere. Sometimes we actually see things in the forest that we think are moss. I actually for many years thought that what is hanging up off these trees was in fact moss. This is actually not moss but lichen. One of the most common types of lichen that we see is one of three categories. It's called fructicose lichen. Fructicose lichen actually looks like fur or hair. You can actually see it looks very much like a plant, but it's actually a combination of fungus and algae. Sometimes there's also assistance by cyanobacteria. And what this new joint symbiotic compound organism can do is very much like plants. It can actually photosynthesize. It can take sunlight and use it to convert carbon dioxide and break it down into oxygen that it releases for us and for other creatures to absorb and breathe. And it also takes it and makes it into food and energy. So hard to believe this is not a plant, but it is actually lichen. Lichen is actually a pioneer species. It is actually incredibly important for the development of any forest. It actually shows up, it's one of the first things to show up after large events like volcanoes or a glacier coming through and stripping off all the topsoil right down to the bare rock, or even after fires. And what it can do is it can withstand incredible temperatures, both very, very high temperatures and very low temperatures. And once it's back in place, once the fungi and the algae start working together, they can actually, over time, break down the rock and convert it into soil so that other plants can start to, or plants can actually start to grow in that area. So it's essential for us to have a very healthy forest. Another category of lichen is actually this one. It's called foliose lichen, and you can actually see, as the name might suggest, that it looks a little bit like a leaf. It has two distinct sides to it. And I'm going to ask you if any of you have any names that you've heard associated with this type of lichen here. And the third category of lichen is actually known as crustose lichen. It actually looks very much like chalk or makeup, and actually attaches directly on to the substrate, in this case a piece of wood, but it could also be onto rocks in the area. So I was talking about the ability of lichen to withstand dramatic changes in temperature and very harsh, severe environments. And they've actually taken lichen and sent it up into outer space, and several species of lichen have actually survived in outer space. So it's actually something in future missions to other planets that scientists will be looking for, something that might indicate that there is life or the potential for life on other planets. So talking about the importance of lichen, it's also important for us to realize that lichen is a very good indicator of the health of a forest. It actually is going to be absorbing oxygen directly out of the air. It's also going to be taking in moisture through the outside layer. And just as importantly for us, again, it's going to be taking nitrogen out of the air and doing what we call fixing nitrogen. It's actually going to be changing it into a form that other organisms and plants can use, essentially a natural fertilizer that's going to help enrich the value of the forest itself. We also are finding out now that to find out the health of a forest, we look for lots of different types of lichen. The more types of lichen you have there, typically the healthier that forest is. It's actually going to be absorbing lots of pollutants and chemicals. There are certain lichens that are very much affected by certain chemicals. So if you have lots of just a few types of lichen, but you're missing some that you would expect in that area, that is something to investigate and find out what is in the environment. Scientists are also taking lichen and testing it to see what it has absorbed over time. We had talked a little bit about moss before. Moss is also a pioneer species. It actually provides a protective blanket for soil and other organisms and bacteria that are in that soil. So in very, very warm places, having moss on top of there will actually help provide a damp cooling for that, what's underneath the soil and the plants and the bacteria. And in very, very cold conditions, it acts like an actual blanket to keep that soil and the organisms that are in it warm enough. So if you do have any other questions, we would love to answer them. Send them in, as I say, on the chat line, and we can use them on future fun facts and also on Facebook postings. So thank you again, and we hope that you can come up with some ideas for future Connecting with Nature Live episodes. Thanks again.